Welcome, 8 Green students. Today we are going to start talking about the road to independence, and we are going to look at 30 causes or 30 events that led the 13 colonies to end up declaring independence and ultimately having the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. I kind of look at these as a series of dominoes that started to fall. Some of the events are tied directly to each other. Some of them are standalone events. Some of them are people. And they all contributed to this road to independence. So let's get going. And we may not get through all 30 of them. I may break this up into a couple of different parts because that's a lot to get through. So here we go. Number 1, and you'll see each slide will have a number at the top, and then it'll have the title. Years are there. Years or sometimes specific dates are there only to give you kind of a context or frame of reference. You do not have to memorize any dates or years. All right, so we look back. One of the earliest causes of our road to independence was the Navigation Acts, and we talked about this in Chapter 4. This was a set of laws that England used to restrict colonial trade, and you're ultimately looking to make money for the mother country, and that was a system called mercantilism. We watched a couple short video clips on that in Chapter 4. This obviously led to some tension between the colonies and the mother country. It also led to smuggling, which the smuggling then in turn hurt the mother country's economy as well. England tried to enforce these trade laws as strictly as they could, but it was pretty difficult back in the time of trying to track smuggling ships on the Atlantic Ocean. Number 2, rights and freedoms. So rights and freedoms, we talked about the term inalienable rights last chapter. These are basic God-given rights that cannot be taken away. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, trial by jury, participation in government, those types of things. And the colonists wanted those. Pausing for a bell. The colonists wanted those inalienable rights, but they weren't always given to them, and so that became an issue. Number 3, I'm lumping together two movements at the same time because they were happening kind of at the same time. So the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, we talked about those also in Chapter 4. Both the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening challenged or led colonists to begin challenging authority, church authority, government authority, and it really started to create what we think of as an American identity. Nobody really said, I'm an American, until the mid to late 1700s, we start hearing that term. They were American colonists, or they were British colonists or English colonists, but nobody really said, I'm an American. But that term starts popping up a little bit here after the Enlightenment and Great Awakening. And of course, we talked about Benjamin Franklin and all the awesome stuff he did, with Poor Richard's Almanac and the Lending Library and the City Hospital and Fire Department, meteorology, Postal Service, all the inventions with, the bifocal glasses and lightning rod and things like that. All right, French and Indian War. So how can one war lead to another war? Well, the French and Indian War led to a huge amount of war debt. And debt is money that you owe to companies or private individuals, and Britain had to pay off that war debt, and so to do that, they're going to start raising taxes, which we'll get to in a little bit. This also gave the colonists valuable fighting experience and some confidence in themselves, and they really started to begin to question whether or not they even needed, England to protect them. So the war itself wasn't a cause of the road to independence, but it's kind of the after effects of the French and Indian War with this large war debt and the valuable fighting experience. Number 5, Pontiac's Rebellion. So Chief Pontiac was an Ottawa Indian chief who was upset over the American colonists moving into his lands in the Ohio River Valley, and so he launched an attack on colonial forts, and this lasted about 3 years. This is where we saw the gifts of death with the smallpox blankets. But really what Pontiac's Rebellion did is, once again, it gave the colonists valuable fighting experience. And once again, Great Britain gained even a larger debt. So They just got off of a 9-year war with the French and Indian War. Now they have to fund this 3-year Indian uprising out in the Ohio River Valley. So England was racking up some war debt pretty quickly. The Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation Line forbid colonial settlement. This is number 6 on your list. Forbid colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So that Ohio River Valley that the colonists had just fought long and hard for is now being reserved for the Indians. And Great Britain sent over 10,000 soldiers to try to enforce this law. And of course, we had thousands that began ignoring it, many of them using Daniel Boone's Wilderness Road. The Sugar Act, 1764. The Sugar Act placed a tax or a duty on sugar, molasses, coffee, silk, wine, lumber, iron, and whale products. Okay, so any of these items that were going to be shipped out of the colonies and maybe sent to England, they were being taxed. So the colonists were actually having to pay a tax on their items that they were actually shipping out. Writs of assistance, think of this as a fancy word for a search warrant. Writs of assistance allowed British customs officials to search anywhere for smuggled goods. They could search ships, warehouses, homes, and they had the power to do so without any kind of probable cause. It was just kind of a blanket search warrant that allowed them to search anytime, any place. Number 8 is the Currency Act. The Currency Act of 1764 didn't affect your average everyday citizen. It really affected more of your merchants and people who owed debts to England and did a lot of trading with England. And what this law said basically was that all debts had to be paid in gold or silver. Colonists were not allowed to pay debts or taxes using colonial paper currency. And remember, back then, every colony had its own paper money. There was no such thing as the U.S. dollar yet. So Massachusetts had its own money, Connecticut had its own money, Virginia had its own money, New York had its own money. And basically England said, we don't want your colonial currency, we want gold and silver, which really kind of makes sense, but it angered the colonists. All right, the Stamp Act. This was a big one, 1765. This is what really gets people fired up in the colonies. This was a tax on everyday items, whereas the Sugar Act really taxed those luxury items that not everyday colonists really had to pay that. And then the Currency Act didn't really affect your average everyday colonist, but the Stamp Act does. This was the first direct tax on every colonist. So basically every paper item had to get an extra tax put on it. Newspapers, calendars, playing cards, almanacs, legal papers, books, you name it. If it was something that had to be printed, chances are there was going to be this stamp that was placed on it, this extra tax. And so this really, really fires up the colonists. And this leads to a famous slogan called "No taxation without representation." The first person to be given credit for this was a man named James Otis. James Otis was a member of a group called the Sons of Liberty. We'll get to them here in a little bit. But James Otis basically said that if we can't elect members of Parliament, then Parliament should not be able to tax us. Now, keep in mind, the average colonist was paying about $1.20 a year, which is about $15 in today's currency. So they were not being heavily taxed, but it was the principle of the fact that they were being taxed by a government that they did not have a hand in electing. And so this slogan, "No taxation without representation," kind of became a rallying cry for the colonists. And we're going to stop at number 10 for right now, and then I will come back and record starting at number 11.